Welcome to the first of 3 videos about the Reformed tradition. This one in particular is just an introduction to the Reformed tradition. If you have not yet watched the welcome video up in the announcements part of the Moodle site, please pause this, go do that. There's a preliminary assignment there where you just write down some of your initial thoughts around the Reformed tradition. I think it's helpful for you to have done that before you watch these videos. That'll help our conversations when we're together in the Zoom classroom. Now, though, I want to do an introduction to the Reformed tradition and think with you a little bit about what it means to be Reformed and particularly Presbyterian. What I'm going to do is just give you just a kind of a general overview of what's going on in the United States and then walk you through what I would do if I were doing a new members class for a Presbyterian church, and then go more deeply into that story so we can encounter more complexity and finally come to a place where we can do a little more academic and I would say missiological reflection on what it means to be Reformed and what it means to be with you to be studying these living Christian movements as we participate with God in God's mission for the world. There are somewhere between 45 and 70 denominations in the United States that could fall under the umbrella of Reformed. It does depend on what size you want a group of congregations to be before you call them a denomination, and the definition of Reformed, because Reformed itself has multiple definitions, some of them landing more theologically, some of them landing a little more on the polity side of things. There are some very small Reformed denominations, sometimes even 2 or 3 congregations or 2 or 3 churches that have come together. Even that tells you something about the Reformed tradition and a propensity in the Reformed tradition for people to have theological and particularly theological convictions that cause them to make choices to split off. And that's even seen in our mission work, particularly in Korea, and I'll say just a little bit about that. In terms of main strands of the Reformed tradition that find a home in the United States, there's a strand of the Reformed tradition that goes back to the Netherlands. It's broadly called the Dutch Reformed tradition. The Dutch Reformed tradition came from the Netherlands, settled in the United States, and is now, there are a number of those denominations, but the largest 2 are the Reformed Church of America and the Christian Reformed Church of North America. They were one denomination in the mid-1800s. They split actually over the conversation around whether or not to require their children in those denominations to be part of Christian schools or whether it was permissible to be part of public schools. They are located primarily in New Jersey, New York, and then in the Midwest, Michigan, and Iowa being main places for the Dutch Reformed Church to have settled. Theologically, they look at the Heidelberg Catechism, the Canons of Dort, and the Belgic Confession, and that's where they find a theological home. There are a number of Korean-speaking denominations that are Presbyterian or Reformed denominations. Mainly they're Presbyterian denominations. The largest one is the Korean Presbyterian Church of America. This is the result of Presbyterian mission to Korea, and which really found root there. And the largest Presbyterian churches in the world are actually in Korea. The largest Presbyterian denominations tend to be either in Korea or Africa, not in the United States, but there are certainly now Korean-speaking Presbyterian churches, first-generation churches, which means they continue to speak Korean, second-generation Presbyterian Koreans, which means that they speak English, and then actually now on into third-generation Korean Presbyterian Christians. The United Church of Christ, which is the denomination of Lancaster Theological Seminary, falls under the Reformed umbrella. It is a reunion of the Evangelical and Reformed Church, which is a German Reformed church, and the Congregational Christian Church. The Congregational Christian Church has its roots in New England and a more Puritan theology. It was more congregational in its polity. The Evangelical and Reformed Church had influences from Lutheranism and also was Presbyterian in some of its structure. And so the United Church of Christ has Reformed theology. Those of us in the Presbyterian Church don't consider the UCC polity very Reformed, and that can be an interesting conversation for us to have together, although we certainly look forward to the ministry of the UCC. There are sections of the Episcopal, Baptist, and independent parts of the Protestantism that are Reformed. They tend to be Reformed in their theology, particularly in what we might call a Calvinist soteriology, or in their adherence to the Westminster Confession, which is a primary English Reformed confession that has had a large influence on American Presbyterianism. But that depends on your definition of Reformed, because Episcopal, Baptist, and independent churches are not Reformed in terms of their polity, sometimes not Reformed in terms of their understanding of baptism. And then, of course, there are the Presbyterian denominations, and there are, I'm going to slide my screen over here, and I'll probably slide it back for some other screens, but there are between 10 and 12 Presbyterian denominations. The Presbyterian Church USA, of which I am a member, is the largest of those denominations, and that'll be our focus, although I will mention some of those other denominations so that you can get a little bit of an understanding of who they are. When Presbyterian churches are telling our own story, in other words, when we're in a new members class and when people don't understand who we are, we'll say things like, we've got 9,100 churches, we've got over 1 million members, we're in all 50 states, we're a national denomination with a headquarters in Louisville, Kentucky, which actually happened after a reunion of Northern and Southern churches in 1983 as a way to say we want to be a denomination that's in the center and that it encompasses our whole denomination. We will often say that we are a democratic representative church government, which is true about us. Sometimes we will say we're related to how the United States government was formed. That is not historically accurate, although it's an internal story that the U.S. government is based on Presbyterianism. There are similarities and there are overlaps, and there was a large influence, I would say, of Presbyterianism and Reformed thinking in terms of how this country came to write some of its constitutional parts of it. That means we have locally congregations that are elected by and that's the leaders of a congregation are elected by the congregation. Regionally, we have these geographical groups called presbyteries. They're half clergy, half ruling elders. And then nationally, we have a General Assembly that meets every other year. And when that group gathers, it is half teaching elders, half ruling elders, half ministers, half elders, half clergy, half lay, although we don't tend to use the word lay in our polity for some theological understandings. We will say the only clergy signer of the Declaration is Reverend John Witherspoon. He is a Presbyterian minister. There are some other Baptist pastors that were signers, although they maybe wouldn't have used the title. So again, that's one of those things where we tell a story about ourselves. It may not be the most accurate story. We often say we've got educated, learned clergy. We require master's degrees. That's been a point of historical emphasis for us. We know as we gather in a class that we're not the only denomination that requires that. And we will say we're people of the word. We value sermons. We base decisions on the Bible. Again, as we look at these traditions coming together, we know that Presbyterians aren't the only ones who try to do that, who say that. It certainly is part of our story about ourselves. Reformed theology has an emphasis on the providence, holiness, and glory of God. There's some theological readings that you have that you can see point to that. We are people who have two sacraments. We practice infant baptism and adult baptism, but we will baptize the children of believing parents, or actually our polity says that one of the parents needs to want to bring that child for baptism. We won't do baptism if it's a grandparent. In other words, we really want that the person who has the parental authority. It can be a guardian, but the person has the parental influence over that person's life to bring that person for that person to be a member of a Christian church and want that infant to be baptized. We practice communion. We practice what's called an open communion, with an emphasis, sometimes with some emphasis from Zwingli on remembering the sacrifice of Jesus, and sometimes more with an emphasis from Calvin on gratitude for the gift of God in Jesus Christ and a celebration of God's food that God gives to all people. Our worship aims to reflect the majesty and glory of God. You'll see that some in the architecture when you watch the videos about the sanctuaries, and the music would tend to do that. We have, as Presbyterians, wanted to have worship that brings people into an understanding that God is holy and just. A phrase that you hear Presbyterians say is that we do things decently and in order. That is a phrase that comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 40. It's actually about worship. It made its way into one of our confessions, the Scots Confession. And that's in chapter 20 of the Scots Confession, which is about councils. And so in there it says we want to have kind of church order that's decently and in order. And you find in Presbyterianism an emphasis on polity, on process, on working together and understanding how to do things well. A deeper story for us, most of our worshipers are 55 or older when the median age in the United States is 44. So we are a graying denomination. 55 to 60% of our members are women, 40 to 45% are men. So we're weighted toward women members. 51% of our ruling elders, that would be our congregationally elected leaders, are women. 49% are men. So we're just about 50-50 there. On the teaching elder, ministers of word and sacrament, we're more like a third, 2/3. We ordained our first woman as a congregational leader, a ruling elder, in 1930. Actually, you can go back a little bit before that, and deacons, we also have deacons, and I can say a little bit more about that in class, were ordained as women before that. 1956 was the first woman who was ordained as a minister or a teaching elder for us. Little later than that, 1965, for the Southern Presbyterian Church, the PCUS. If you go even deeper into our story, you discover that in 1965, if you combine the Northern and Southern Presbyterian churches, there were 4.25 million members. We have less than 1.35 million today, in a stretch of history, of course, where our country's demographics have grown and our population has grown. We have a history of splits. A major split during the Civil War over slavery, with a reunion in 1983, so it took a long time for us to come back together. There are then some smaller splits even kind of during that and after that. The Presbyterian Church in America split off in 1973, mainly a Southern denomination, although some movement into other parts of the country. The Evangelical Presbyterian Church in 1981, and that was a Midwestern split. And the Evangelical Covenant Order of Presbyterians, ECO, in 2012. I'll say just a little bit more about that split in a minute. So you can see we have a history of kind of these, when we come to major points of people going their separate ways. Demographically, we're 88 to 91% white, 3.5% to 5% Black or African American. So you can see we're a very white congregation. That is something that is of interest and concern to people who are in leadership. There's a heavy emphasis, a strong emphasis, I'll say, in terms of racial justice and social justice, with ongoing conversations about those kinds of issues. About 60% of our members are college educated versus 30% of the people in the United States. There is, in my estimation, an upside and a downside to that. There certainly is a desire to think deeply and think robustly about all parts of life in the Reformed tradition. It can tend itself towards what we might call religion of the head, which cannot connect with people for whom reading, talking, sitting around is a primary way that they live those lives. There's a couple of streams of the Reformed tradition, including emphasis on the glory and sovereignty of God, and then the Reformed always reforming, kind of like we're always kind of learning new, and those collide for us sometimes. There's an ongoing questions around election and predestination for us, which sometimes we're known for in terms of being people who talk about predestination. In class, I can say a little bit more about what that actually means for us. And there's been controversy since the 1970s about human sexuality, marriage, and ordination that results in a change in definition of marriage and an openness to ordination to all people. That's actually a local option in all cases for us. Starting point in terms of us, I would want to start not with our theology, our polity, our history, but actually there's a quote that I've provided for you from Participating in God's Mission that says we really need to start with what they call our Euro-tribal faith traditions. And want you to see that. And then we'll start not with Calvin, not with predestination, but with Geneva and John Knox. And I look forward to exploring that with you.